Thanks, Ross. So great. Okay. There you go. Okay, so this is our third show and tell on the mapping services project in emergency response. In fact, actually, someone emailed last week and made a really good point about, is it crisis response, is it emergency response? I think it's kind of emergency response. I guess I'll be interested in to like chat to more teams as well, but I think that's something we should probably like clarify at some point. Also, and another point I'll sort of get onto as well, like I don't think it's just response that we do. So anyway, I'll show what I mean rather than sort of talk about it too much at this point. So just a sort of like reminder, our team is Ross, who's sort of in charge of like planning and stakeholder engagement. There's myself, Harry, who I work on like design research. And then Tom, who is having a week off because it's his girlfriend's birthday, is doing a lot of stuff around like frontline engagement. Cool. So as I said before, this is a conversation, so feel free to ask questions, make comments over video or in the chat. So in this session, I'm going to, as always, like just cover about working in the open, why we map services, what we did last week, and then something I've ominously called planning for the worst, but it's not as bad as that. Okay, so first, like working in the open. You already know about this because you're here, but the show and tell is every Thursday. Do feel free to like forward on the details and you think it might be relevant to or find interesting. Our work is out in the open for anyone to go and look at from our sort of like plan on Trello. You can just see what tasks we're up to at that time. As well, we also have the list of all things we're learning is actually out in the open for anyone to go and look at. We've been blogging about what we're learning and the progress we're making. Tom, who did a really good blog last week, which I'd recommend, which I'll send around after this. So just to sort of recap, like why we're mapping services. Like mapping services can help us confirm what service needs we meet now, identify common tools we need to deliver the current and future services, and I guess decide really like where to focus efforts of service design in tech. And as people sort of asked before, like why are we doing this work? And the main thing is really we want to have more designers and software developers working full-time on emergency response. And the question that always comes back is, what are you going to work on? And this is trying to answer that, basically. And as Ben Holiday, who's sort of quite a well-known designer in the sort of like civic design space, talks about that understanding your services is the first step to improving or transforming them. So last week, we've been refining our list, which is sort of like a living document. In fact, I'll just share that in the chat.
I can share it in the chat for you, Harry.
Thanks,
so keep going.
Yeah, so we've been refining our list. Having Tom on the team has been so useful. Like I've got an okay understanding of what happens in emergency response, but the fact that Tom has been doing it like every working day for the last 2 years has really, really helped. But the next step is to go out and speak to all the people actually in the different teams to understand like how the list compares to your experience of these services and what you understand it is that we do and the needs we meet. One of the main things we've been up to is just loads of planning. You wouldn't think it would take ages to organize a few meetings, but it does. So Tom and I have been working really hard to go and speak to, and most of this is kicking off next week, but speaking to lots of people who work in our frontline teams. These are some of the chats we've got like this week and next week, which is quite a good mix of teams. But these aren't the only interviews we'll be doing. We'll be doing other ones. We're also going to be doing interviews. I say interviews, I should really call these conversations, because what we're doing is like sharing the list ahead of time and then having a conversation. And those conversations are going to be focused on like what's missing from the list of things that we do. What things are on there but aren't quite right to how you sort of know it. And three, like which things do you do most of? Like which things are like because there's roughly about 30 services on the list so far, like which things are like things, and that's not to be like we don't want to do those services anymore, it's just to get an idea of like proportionality, because once again this is like how do we prioritize what tools we're gonna make. And we're also going to plan to talk to the anti-human trafficking team, Vicky, who's sort of doing this work, this sort of comparative work in the and as is Lindsay in the refugee services. There's sort of like a service that sort of like overlaps. We're trying to understand like where those overlaps are and like what actually happens. Same with the psychosocial team, and also we're going to be talking to a few like external services to understand like what do they think they're getting when they contact us. Yeah, I guess I'm calling this like planning for the worst, but basically what I mean is on the list we've started like grouping all the different services that we do, and it's not, and if you sort of look where I've highlighted on here, like it's not a surprise that response in the sort of, if we're grouping all the services by the sort of what's called the emergency planning cycle, and it's sort of in the name, as I said, like it's emergency response, that the vast majority of what we do is in that part. Now, I guess what I kind of want to find out is like, what are all the, what do we do before emergencies even happen? And I guess that's kind of a discussion to have with you all, like, because I know there is lots of things that we are up to when something hasn't happened. I'm really interested to understand what that is. And in fact, this was quite a big revelation for me when I joined on to emergency response in one way or another, like a year and a half ago, was like learning that you could plan for an emergency. For me, I was like, oh, surely that seems like a sort of a conflict in terms, but really I didn't realize there's this whole like sector of people who like they don't plan for bad stuff to happen, but they anticipate bad stuff to happen and put plans in place that mean that we're going to be less affected by that. And I guess that would be a conversation I'd really, I guess, start to have here, is understand, because I know at the moment like there is more than one service in the mitigation bit, and I just want to get a better sense of from you all, and to kick that conversation off, like what are some of those things. At the moment, the only thing we have in there is something we call like build relationship with local Red Cross, which we understand a lot of councils do, a lot of fire services do, increasingly more community groups do. So yeah, that's kind of the question I wanted to have a bit of a conversation starter about, I guess. But there's some comments in the chat first. Maybe I can speak to those first. Cool. So for this from George, hi all. Wondering who is this George guy who I can see here? Okay. I'm a user researcher and designer working for Waltham Forest Council in London. Read the blog and found it interesting. Oh, cool. Okay, fine. Okay. So, and who are the users of mitigation services? Okay. So I guess that's the bit I want to try and find out more about, like mitigation services. Like, so actually, if I come out here, I'll go to the list that Ross kindly shared. My screen then.
That's a great point from Paul about supporting exercises locally as well. So working with, so it's not necessarily just about the relationship, but there's a practical element to exercising those plans.
Interesting. And so for yourselves as the team, what do you get out of doing the exercises? Like what are you hoping to achieve when you do those? Because I know that's something that does seem to like happen in quite a few different teams.
You can plan all your life until you try it out. You don't know whether it's going to work, especially when you're working with other voluntary sectors and the statutory bodies. So you're working with police, fire, council, the utility companies. You all come together, you've got a plan, you exercise that plan, then you refine it, go back and plan again.
And when you say you don't know how it's going to work, can you tell me more about that?
You don't know how the interaction is going to work on the canoe. Things you have additions to the situation while it's building. You see enough people have services how different react with each other, and you come up with a good way of working together. It's all about, in the end, forming a bond between all the different organisations so that whatever plan you have is effectively delivered. Because if you don't plan, you don't work together and establish exactly where you sit in that plan, it doesn't work.
Thank you. Has anybody else here ever done like a emergency exercise before?
Yeah, I think it also gives the volunteers a sense of what is being required at exercises. They don't normally, if they don't go out a lot, they get a bit disheartened. So to actually go out and practice what they've been taught is a great tool for them.
Interesting. And when, oh, sorry, someone's about to add something to that.
It builds up the confidence of the volunteers. They know what the other agencies can do and will do in a certain situation. So we have different exercises for different things. You have utility exercises, you have reception centre exercises, you have flooding exercises, and in each case, we're meeting people from new agencies for relationships. So when it does happen, there's none of this cell working. There's no working in silos. People know who to go to: the Environment Agency, the council, the fire service, and it makes it work. Without practicing, without exercising, you're never sure what's going to happen on the day. And building up that trust and relationship. In Northamptonshire, we're lucky. We have a thing called the Northamptonshire Emergency Response Corps, where a group of charities, voluntary sector agencies, have worked together for years. I'm the vice chair, which is fortunate, and we have 4x4 search and rescue, first aid groups, and we exercise and train together, so everybody knows the capabilities and what's there to support them and who they're going to be working with.
And going to a question, something Martin Formbuster said, that mitigation is also about business continuity. Can you tell us more about that, Martin?
Sure. Right. Well, writing plans for continuing your operation. So if our building burnt down, what's our contingency? So in that sense, it's a mitigation activity.
And I guess there's a question wider for everyone. Like, when we say emergency planning, like what's included in that? Like, what are the sort of like broad activities? There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm someone who's quite ignorant to it, and I want to understand it better. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, so I guess that's one of the things we're trying to find at the moment is what's actually in this. Yeah, what's in this mitigation section as well. So maybe if people are done with chatting about mitigation, maybe I can just take through some of the things we've added this week to the list, because I think that's kind of interesting. Is that in a more useful place?
The only thing, Harry, just on mitigation is a point that Lee just mentioned in the chat as well.
Okay.
About just like literally something as simple as don't have plugs. So an exercise that Kathy and I were on in an airport, it was just a simple thing that people didn't know where to stand, and therefore people who were supposed to be getting off the plane were then like filtering through and being lost. And it's a simple thing of just knowing how to set up the restaurants in terms of just, you need to be like a group of people here and then individuals there. That it seemed really simple as we talked about it, and then as you experienced it, you found something completely different. So that kind of like real life running through it was really beneficial, I think, for every partner. And the other thing is that is also building the relationships on within the actual exercise as well. So for example, like our exercise had a chaplaincy team, first aid team, us, the airline team, and the immigration services, and no one knew what each other was there for until we just started as humans having a conversation. And that was also great for then like understanding what we each did, which before that we wouldn't have known, and therefore in an emergency we also wouldn't have known.
That's good to know. Yeah. So going with what Emily's just saying about how to run a rest centre with social distancing and PPE and track and trace and so forth. How do people know how to run rest centres? Because this has definitely come up as like a service, which you wouldn't necessarily find from looking at our website, but like learning how to run a rest centre, like this seems to be coming up quite a bit. Like how do people first learn how to run one of those?
We train with the LRF. They have reception centre managers, as we train with them.
Sorry,
so
Paul,
we
we can't
know
hear
where our role is.
Sorry, Paul, we can't really hear your audio that well. It's quite crackly.
It's this blooming mask. We train with the LRF. I know in Norfolk they have actually trained the reception centre managers themselves. So the training's there, and then we exercise with practice.
Sorry, Paul, it's really hard to. I'm only sort of getting like one about every 3 words. Sorry.
I think that the first thing is to actually have that as a training program for people when they first come on board. What is a rest centre? The different rest centres, and I think that in the ER training package that's now touched upon, but I think there's got to be a bit more training on initially about what rest centres are and what they do, and then after that, I think it would be really good if volunteers went on exercises so they could get a feel of what was happening. So making them understand the initial things about them, but then move on to actually exercising with what you've just learned.
Interesting. And Katharina, like how do they make it real? Like, is that kind of a hard thing to do?
Well, that is hard because you never know what incident you're going to have. But we when we do the training, we make a scenario up and we go by that scenario. And then when we work with the LRF, they come up with a scenario and we work towards that with them. And we start from the beginning and how we move forward. So right from the call out to the rest centre and what we do in there to the end of the debrief. If that makes sense.
No, it definitely makes sense. So I guess it's probably actually more of a conceptual thing here. Like, do people think there is a difference between mitigation and preparedness? Also, there's no right or wrong answer here, and maybe it's a slightly like philosophical one, but it's kind of interesting to understand.
I think they lap over.
Is there any areas in the local ER teams, is there any areas that differentiate between the work that you do, which is more mitigation and more preparedness? Is there anything that's more one than the other? Like, just to understand what that looks like, I suppose, in context.
I guess just to get a bit philosophical about it, I've always perceived risk mitigation to be taking a risk and kind of reducing it, whereas preparedness isn't actually changing the risk, it's changing how people react to the risk. So I'd probably say that we don't really work in mitigation, but we actually do work in preparedness, but that we can advise partners and colleagues in the areas that do risk mitigation on what that risk could mean to people and the humanitarian impact of that risk, and potentially advocate and support colleagues in emergency planning, in utilities, etc., to mitigate that risk, and we prepare them to help people deal with it. But I think that's just kind of my interpretation. It's probably a bit different for everyone.
May I come in as well? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
I was just going to build on what Lee's saying. I think that's a really valid point, but I would say that we probably do have some mitigation activities without realising it. So, for example, with the UK Power Networks, when we go out and we are providing sort of hot drinks and, you know, kind of warm clothing, we're also letting people know that they can sign up to the priority register, so therefore they can receive additional support. It's the same thing when there's flooding in rest centres. You know, we'll be saying to people, did you know you can sign up for flood alerts, and therefore you can be made aware of sort of the different levels and any incoming weather, and you can take steps to prepare yourself, make sure you've got the things that you need. And I would argue that that would probably fall within that mitigation kind of category. So you can't entirely remove the risk, but you can help people become better prepared for it.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. So actually, potentially, when we're maybe in that sort of phase 3 aspect in the sort of list that we're working to, when we're responding, we're maybe helping people to mitigate from a future emergency, and then it's sort of more like we've said already, and we talked about this last week, it's just a big cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't always do those activities when we are responding. For example, we'll have county fairs and things, and we'll tell people about what we do. We'll go out there, we'll talk about the Red Cross, and we'll still advise that, did you know you can have home fire safety checks? Have you checked your smoke alarms recently? So there are steps that we can take that help people to keep themselves safe and hopefully then prevent those kind of incidents that we usually called out to.
Got you.
Hayley, you said that you train people. Like, which people do you train?
It's the volunteer teams in our areas, but the local LRFs put training on to train us in their rest centres and how they'd like things run as well. So it's a two-way street, as well as the other partner agencies.
Interesting. And so I'm checking out. I know we're doing comments in education service. Oh yeah, I remember someone mentioning about fire safety checks, but it's not something we necessarily do anymore. Yeah, I was just going to cover off like some services which we've like recently added to the list. So response. Yeah, one of the things we actually want to find out more about is like power cuts, like from the user research we've done so far. So that we're starting to, I guess, like fill in the map a bit more through like the user research that Vicky did in support line early in the year, the user research Joe Straw and myself did on Fires Flood last year, after doing some great work around like the cache-based assistance discovery. But we know there's like a big gap in understanding the needs of, I'm talking about our team, around the needs of people who experience power cuts. I wonder if someone has a sort of like high level summary of like what are the sort of needs that people have in that situation.
I can start if it helps, but when we went to food, it depends how the power cut has happened. If it happened through a water leak, which is what can happen as well, it can be that they need to actually evacuate the place. Not always, but obviously that can be an added on. Often phone service of any kind, if people hadn't planned to charge their phone, was a big part, and therefore that connection to kind of their support network. So we helped them like link with that. Lighting as well. Sometimes the fire team bring like big industrial lights, but not always. We have torches on the vehicles. Yeah, there's just a few that jump to mind as you said that.
So we've got the welfare of young children, picking up food for young children, people who have medical disabilities that need to get to the toilet up the stairs. They can't get up the stairs because the stair lift's not working. So you have a variety of things that could go wrong.
Is there a lot of welfare checks? I think maybe Emily, you said about the priority services register. Is there sort of link between those two and power cuts?
Yeah, there is, because the company would know the most vulnerable people if they've signed up to the priority service, who they are first of all. So they would make them their priority, but then they would go around to the other people as well to see if they need assistance.
Interesting. Yeah, and do we think is there any other way of like trying to find out if they're like people who are particularly vulnerable in that situation, other than the sort of priority service list?
Apart from knocking on the door, I don't think there is.
Is there quite a lot of that, like knocking on doors?
Yeah.
When it's unknown, yeah. Sorry, Kathy, I didn't mean to speak over.
No, it's all right, it's fine.
So you're about to say something, Emily?
No, sorry, I was just going to build on what Kathy was saying. So where Sometimes there's kind of incomplete data. We've got an indication that there is vulnerability within the area, but we don't know what particular streets it is, which houses, whether that data has changed. And so that's often when we'll be asked to go and knock on certain streets and to check, particularly in the case of some of the utilities providers. But obviously it does differ a little bit as well from one to the other.
And you say data, like which data are you sort of like referring to?
So that's what they hold on their own customers. So they ask their customers to sign up to their sort of priorities list if they meet certain criteria. So those with, you know, sort of very young children, for example, those that have kind of mobility issues, and, you know, there's obviously various different criteria. But the utilities providers like to be aware of that so that they can prioritise them should they need additional help or checking on, say, for example, the power goes out, the heating goes out.
This sort of reminds me of this bit that we're kind of trying to get our heads around in a minute. We've only got a couple more minutes, but talking about like who instigates the services. Like some of the services are like a bit more clear, I guess, around like what someone's like trying to do. So like someone trying to prepare for a flood, like they're individually the person trying to instigate that. Whereas there seems to be a lot of services we do where it's kind of instigated by another organization contacting us. So it might be a utilities company around power cuts or local council around flooding. I haven't necessarily got an answer for that yet, but it's just kind of like something that comes up in that actually the end user isn't, the ultimate end user is someone who's been affected by an emergency, but the actual, like the person who's kicking that thing off is actually is another organization, which is like quite interesting. And will we sort of like build up our own list? Does the data get updated based on what we find out when we go to the areas?
I mean, I can only speak for UKPN, and to be fair, we've had fewer incidents in the past year or so, but we had a particular form that we filled out on their behalf and we then passed back to them, as well as completing our own kind of incident report forms.
And were there people who, like, on the list you were surprised that you sort of like met, like, oh, I'm kind of surprised this person wasn't on anybody's radar, so to speak?
Yes, absolutely. But Lee made a really good sort of point in the chat, which is that it is an opt-in. So even if people are vulnerable and they don't want to be included on the list, they don't necessarily have to be. So that obviously they have to give their consent to be contacted should something happen.
And kind of on occasion, the lists tend to be by property, not by person. So for example, Severn Trent can list a property as needing priority service, but then they've moved and someone else has moved in, just as Daniel said, like, the person who's now moved into the house is listed as vulnerable and the person who's moved out is not listed as vulnerable, but it should be the other way around. So there is a lot of kind of shock and surprise there when sometimes when we knock on someone's door and they think, why are you knocking on our door?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask as a follow-up question. So we're out of time. Is that what you're about to say, Ross?
Yeah, I was going to say, so we're bang on 4 now, which means that it's, again, time to come to an end this week, which is a shame. Another fun-filled week. But I was going to ask just, you know, in the chat or email after, if there's any feedback about how you feel these show and tell sessions are going, they'd be, you know, really, really helpful. I appreciate a couple of people reached out after last week's session to give some feedback, and it was really appreciated. So if there's any constructive feedback, if there, you know, if these are useful, then either in the chat or on email after, it just gives us a bit of a temperature check to see, are we on the right path? Are we giving you the information that you want to hear about as we go through our project? Yeah, I agree. It was nice to not have to talk about COVID for a while. But in the spirit of zapping Zoom, which I think is how the people director are talking about it, we will move these to 25-minute sessions from next week onwards. I know, sorry, Lee, you want it to be longer. I know. Harry and I could talk about this all day, but yeah. So thanks so much again, everyone. Harry, anything else you wanted to add in?
No, that's it. Thanks for coming, and yeah, hopefully you found it useful enough to come next time.
Yeah, I'm not sure we do
10
encores.
more minutes. 10 more minutes.